If you want to get serious about filmmaking, consider getting a true cinema camera. But you don't have to spend the big bucks. I will show you very cheap options as cheap as $600 on the used market. These cameras were made to either deliver outstanding image quality or have a very nice body design and button layout. Some of these cameras really hold up today and deliver images for the big screen. You can get them as cheap as around $1,000 on the used market. I will not just read off a spec list from the internet. I either owned the cameras I'm talking about or have used them on a professional client shoot. I will also tell you about all the weaknesses and strengths of all these cameras and if these cameras will work for your needs. But let's talk about what makes a cinema camera special. Other than a hybrid camera most people use today on YouTube, these cameras were specifically made to capture moving images. Therefore they have features like internal ND filters, XLR audio, or last for a very long time with their battery life. They also have no recording limits. Also the image quality is top notch. When these cameras were released, they delivered the best images on the market. That's why they will still hold up today. This list is in no particular order, so this is no top tier list or something because every camera has its strengths and weaknesses, so let's get started. The first camera I want to talk about is the Canon C100. It was released in 2012 and costs around $800 to $1,200 on the used market. This first small EOS cinema camera had very nice features: internal ND filters, XLR audio input, and with a paid upgrade you could also get the great dual pixel autofocus even though it was only a single point in the middle of the screen. The special thing about the C100 was that it used a 4K sensor which downscaled to 1080p for the very best 1080p 8-bit 420 image you can get on the market. It also captures in Canon's own C-Log, has very nice dynamic range and great low-light capabilities. It's also built like a tank and very sturdy. The negatives are very obvious. This camera cannot record 4K and it also is not able to record higher frame rates above 30p. It can record 60i, but if you want to use that for your slow motion, you will cut your resolution in half. The successor to the C100, the C100 Mark II, could record up to 60p, but on the used market this camera is still twice as much as the C100. This camera also has no 10-bit or RAW output. Some people claim that it can output somewhat around 10-bit, but what they really mean is that the color subsampling when you output over HDMI is 422, which does increase the color detail. So who's this camera for? I think many broadcasters will still accept the image quality coming out of the C100, and if you are not too fancy about higher frame rates, this camera delivers really great cinematic high dynamic range images in a very nice and sturdy 1080p footage. Also the ease of use, the great body design and the overall functionality is really great. I used it on a corporate shoot and I was very fond of the AF performance because on this shoot autofocus was very key, and as you might know I use Panasonic cameras most of the time and they are not that good when it comes to autofocus. So if great dynamic range, 1080p and autofocus performance are key for you, I think the C100 will suit your needs. The next camera is the Sony FS100, which was also released in 2012 and costs around $600 to $1,100 on the used market. It was Sony's answer to the EOS C100 and is also a very nice package. It features the same great image sensor as its bigger brother, the Sony F3, which is a Cine Alta camera by the way. It shoots 1080p up to 60 frames per second and also has the capabilities to shoot slow motion up to 200 frames per second, albeit it's only for 3 seconds and an SD quality. The sensor on this camera is what makes it special. It has a very low megapixel count, which means you don't get any moire. You have very great low light capabilities and nice dynamic range. You don't get S-Log, but I think the dynamic range holds up quite well. You get great battery life with Sony's NP-F batteries, and you have all the buttons and switches you need for professional shooting. When it comes to the negatives, this camera's box-shaped design isn't for everyone. It doesn't have dedicated viewfinder, it only uses a strange clip-on viewfinder, which I never used. It only shoots its 1080p in 8-bit 420, but it can output 8-bit in 422. Sadly, there is also no internal ND filters and no 4K recording options. I actually owned this camera and used it for several years for indie features and also for events and weddings. I think the image holds up quite well, but the slow motion quality was okay for its time, but nowadays I would only use the 1080p 60 for slow motion. I also think it's great that you don't need to rig this camera out in order to make it work. You can use it straight away out of the box. In regards to the FS100, I will briefly mention two other cameras I've used that are very closely related to the FS100 but aren't quite in the same price range. First, we talk about the Sony F3, which you can get on the used market right now from $900 on up to $1,300. As I already mentioned, it uses the same sensor as the Sony FS100 and is able to output 10-bit 422 and record in S-Log. So this camera is far more professional, also the button layout makes more sense, you have a dedicated viewfinder and you get internal ND filters. The negatives are that you still don't get the higher frame rates and you have a proprietary mount, which means that if you get this camera used, try to get it with the mount that you already use for your lenses. Otherwise this can get very expensive, and also the need for an external recorder to get the 10-bit footage is also an additional cost. I was only able to use this camera as a DP on one shoot, and what I remember is that it was a very nice shooting experience, but it is a very heavy camera, so keep that in mind. The other camera I want to briefly mention is the Sony FS700, which you can get for around $700 if it's not upgraded, and around $1,000 if you get the upgraded 4K version. Shortly after the FS100, Sony released the update, the FS700, which featured internal NDs and the ability to output 4K up to 100 frames per second and 2K up to 200 frames per second. Keep in mind that these higher frame rates only are available in short 8-second bursts, so you are rather limited on that. If you consider this camera, keep in mind that without an external recorder, this camera can only record internally in the same flavors as the FS100, which is 1080 60p in 8-bit 420. You need an external recorder like the Atomos Shogun or the Odyssey 7Q in order to record ProRes or Cinema DNG externally. I owned the Sony FS700 and the Odyssey 7Q for a while and used it on corporate shoots and indie films, and I have to say it delivers great image quality. I shot in ProRes most of the time because the Cinema DNG was very cumbersome to use back when I owned it. It delivers great images, but the setup gets expensive and it gets really heavy, and you have to keep that in mind if you want to get this setup. The next camera is the Panasonic AF100 or AF101 or AF102, which was also released in 2012 and is actually very cheap for around $600 to $900 on the used market. This camera has everything you need: XLR audio input, viewfinder, internal NDs, and all with an MFT sensor and an MFT mount. The MFT mount is very flexible, you can virtually adapt any lens, and it also works with the Metabones Speedbooster. You should get this camera for its ease of use. It has a rather large body, but the button layout and the functionality is very nice and it's not that heavy. You can record up to 1080 and 60p, which is very nice for some slow-mo action. And I think the codec is very nice, albeit it's not 10-bit and you can't output 10-bit, so there's that. When it comes to the negatives, I think the sensor is its biggest downside. It's the GH1 sensor, so it's an older design and it has a rather limited dynamic range and not that good of low light capabilities. So this camera shines in controlled environments, and if you don't need the low light capabilities and work on sets, I think this camera will suit you just fine and deliver great images. I had this camera for some time as the B and C cam to my GH5, but since the image quality doesn't really match, the colors are very different, I sold it. Next is the Blackmagic cinema camera from 2013. You can get this camera around 500 to 900 bucks. Blackmagic stirred the camera market up back when they released its cinema camera, which could record cinema DNG up to 2.K. It was a big hit, but an even bigger hit was the Pocket Cinema camera, which they released shortly after. It could record full HD up to 30p in RAW 12-bit and ProRes, which was quite nice. The image quality was outstanding, the flexibility was nice, it was a very small design, which is also great for some situations, and the wide dynamic range and image quality holds up till today. But sadly, there are a lot of downsides to this camera. There are no internal ND filters, the battery life is terrible, the audio is also terrible, so you need to rig this camera up in order for you to make it work. Another downside is the very small sensor, which means it doesn't have great low light capabilities, the lens selection is rather limited, you need to use a Metabones Speedbooster in order to make it look like a Super 35 camera. I actually owned two of these cameras for several years because the image quality was very reminiscent to the Arri Alexa. The dynamic range is nice, but in the end I sold them for its very bad usability. But if you have the time and want to spend some extra bucks for rigging this camera out, this camera delivers really great images. You will not regret it in terms of image quality. Like with the Sony FS100, I have to briefly mention two other cameras which are very closely related to the Pocket Cinema camera, but aren't really in the price range we are talking about. The first camera is the Pocket Cinema camera 4K, which was released in 2019 and costs around 1100 bucks. This camera was a substantial upgrade. It's not really pocketable, the size is quite bigger than the original Pocket Cinema camera, but it can record great 4K images in its own Blackmagic RAW and ProRes up to 60p. It also records 2.8K in RAW up to 120 frames per second, so you have some slow motion capabilities there. It sports a bigger Micro Four Thirds sensor and might be the best low light capability camera on this list. This camera also has mini XLR inputs, so you can get professional audio from this camera. There are some downsides to it. There are no internal ND filters and the battery life is still a mess. So you still need to rig out this camera, and I used it for some event shooting and music videos. I was very pleased with the image quality, but overall the lack of a tiltable screen and the bad battery life and the need to rig it out made it not really usable for me. But if you can work around that, the image quality is really nice and you will not regret it in this regard. The other camera I want to mention is the Micro Cinema camera. This camera costs around 900 bucks on the used market and 1300 bucks new. It has the same sensor as the Pocket Cinema camera, but has a different body design. It's a cube shape and it can record up to 60p, so you have somewhat of slow motion capabilities. The box shape isn't for everyone. I think it's not that nice since you have to really rig this camera out, but if you are into this thing, I think this is a very nice budget option. Be aware that you need a handle and a monitor in order to handle this camera quite nice. The button layout is very terrible. That's the reason why I sold this camera shortly afterwards. I got it, the image quality is great, but the usability is really a pain. There is some workaround with third-party remotes like the My Little Goat that are really nice and can help you control this camera much easier with a nice setup, but for me it didn't work. Now at last I have two other cameras for you that are a lot different than the cameras I mentioned before, so take it with a grain of salt, and I think it's more of an honorable mention than really cameras that should belong on such a list. The first honorable mention is a Super 8 camera. I got my Beaulieu 4008 for $200, so it's very cheap. Why not shoot real film? We adore the film look. The Kodak film stock is still one of the best images you can get on the planet. The dynamic range is unrivaled until this day. We are talking about the same dynamic range as in blockbusters like Star Wars. But there are a lot of downsides to Super 8. First of all, the sensor size is really small, so you don't get that shallow depth of field, and also the resolution isn't that high. Even if you scan Super 8 film in 2K, you only get a resolution that is comparable to digital 720. Other bigger drawback are the expenses. Even though the cameras themselves are really cheap, the film stock and the process afterwards is very expensive. You need to get a cartridge, you need to get it developed, you need to get it scanned, and all that process for a 2-minute cartridge will cost you around $100. So in terms of long-time expenses, Super 8 isn't really cheap. But I think for artistic purposes and maybe indie features, I think it can deliver some very outstanding and extraordinary images. Also, if you need sound, be aware that you need to record it externally. As I already mentioned, I own a Super 8 camera and I planned on shooting an indie feature on this camera, but I wasn't able to get the funding in order to cover the cost of the Super 8 film stock. But I think it's still a great option for artistic purposes. And the other honorable mention is the Red one. Red really stirred up and destroyed the celluloid film camera market back in 2008 when they released the Red 1 and later on the Red 1MX, which had a better sensor. You can get these high-end cinema cameras for a rather low price nowadays. The body alone costs around $2,000 on the used market and the full kit costs around $4,000. And if the image quality was good enough for David Fincher, it will be good enough for you. You can record up to 4K in this camera, which is rather soft, and 2K up to 120 frames per second. It features the really great internal compressed red RAW codec, which you can easily edit in almost any editing suite. I use this camera on 2 short films and I think it has great image quality, but it is a behemoth that weighs around 10 kilograms. So if you want to get this camera, get ready to buy some big and sturdy tripods. So that's my list of super cheap cinema cameras that I used over the past years, and I think they can still deliver great images today. So if you are someone who starts out as an indie filmmaker or as someone who wants to make corporate videos, events and weddings, I think you will get nice images with either one of these cameras. I know there are great hybrid cameras out there, but some of them are much more expensive and lack features like internal NDs and XLR audio inputs that are crucial for a professional work environment. These are just cameras I used over the past years. If you know cameras that should be on this list, please mention them in the comments down below. Which camera, in your opinion, makes most sense nowadays to get as a young filmmaker who wants to start out? And if you like this video, please consider liking, subscribing and hitting the notification bell. I hope you have a nice day and create something extraordinary.